Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Trent University's alumni for the class of '66, and the first alumni to be appointed Chancellor of the University of Trent, Dr. Don Tapscott.
Okay, well, let's get at it. First of all, let me begin by saying that I'm delighted to be here, and I really mean that. I've had my share of appointments and jobs and accolades and so on over the years, but I've never been more delighted or more proud than to be the first alumni chancellor of Trent University. And the theme of the symposium is about ideas that change the world, and we have a world that needs changing. Surrounded by technological wonders and miracles, new advances in science, the development of global supply chains, our productive capacity, we're faced with a situation where in the world, many things are deteriorating. We have growing social inequality all across the Western world. We have structural unemployment. At Davos this year, Eric Schmidt, the erstwhile CEO of Google, was saying you can look to a minimum of 2 decades of structural youth unemployment. Canada, it's over 20%. In other places, Spain, over 60%. The Tunisian revolution was called the unemployment revolution, and unemployment was at 30%. We've got a world that's unsustainable. We are destroying our environment, and climate change threatens to extinguish many species. One of them may be Homo sapien. And conflict is growing. The world is too unequal, it's too unsustainable, it's too unjust, and it's too conflicted. So we need to bring about change. Now, the theme of this symposium, Ideas That Change the World, is broken down into 5 themes. Do I have a thing to advance my slides? Sorry. And the discussion today will be a good one. I hope that we'll be able to make some breakthroughs on these 5 different issues. And what I'm going to do today is to introduce 5 provocative ideas along these 5 themes in the hope of stimulating some discussion. Really? We don't have a remote? This is my punishment for using PowerPoint. They say power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. So we have 5 ideas for a world that needs changing. And the topics are education, life and health, critical cultural inquiry, Indigenous people in Canada, sustainability, and the environment. Well, what I'd like to do is to introduce some ideas on each of these. First, on education, I'd like to argue that the model of pedagogy that we have in our schools and universities is an appropriate one for the 17th century, but is inappropriate for today. Secondly, life and health, I'd like to argue that we need to change the whole paradigm in how we deliver healthcare and how we do medical research, moving to a collaborative model. Thirdly, there's a fragmentation of public discourse. It's occurring in large part because of the digital media. How do we overcome that? The next is that all of us are deeply concerned, in some cases even shocked, by the situation facing Indigenous peoples in this country. And how do we overcome the problem of unemployment in these communities? And I'm going to make the case that entrepreneurship is going to be the key to that, and the internet can help us big time. And the final one is I'm going to argue that what the world needs now on climate change is to create a governance network, a global governance network similar to the ecosystem that governs the internet. If we can govern a resource like the internet through a ragtag community of people, different stakeholders, maybe we could govern other resources, one of them being the climate. So the starting point, as many of you know, I've been spending the last 35 years thinking about the digital revolution and its impact on business and society. And to me, this is the main driver for change that's happening in the world today. The change is not always positive. And just a couple of weeks ago, I finished 12 new chapters of the 20th anniversary of a book called The Digital Economy. This, they say, was the first bestseller about the internet and business. And unbelievably, that was 20 years ago. And it caused me to reflect on the impact of the digital revolution and what's actually occurred. If you flash back to 20 years ago, the world was very different. We accessed the web through dial-up. Remember that? There was no mobile web because there was no mobility, except for the few of us that had a big brick. Remember those things? Google wasn't to come into the marketplace for 5 years. There was no Amazon. There was no eBay. Well, flash forward to today, and we've got an unbelievable explosion that's occurring. We've got the social web, 1.5 billion people that are now connected real time. We have the rise of so-called big data. You've all heard that term, but data is becoming an asset. And I think that the owners of big data are creating new empires of wealth that may far exceed previous empires that we've known based on other resources like minerals or oil or power over people, ancient slave empires, or even financial capital. This is a new form of capital that's emerging. We've got the rise of the so-called Internet of Everything, where billions and trillions of inert objects in our world become smart communicating devices. I have a friend in Toronto, everything in his house that has electrical power has an IP address. That means it's connected to the internet, and all these things talk to each other. I have no idea what his toaster says to his refrigerator, but he was actually bragging that his fence talks to his sprinkler system. And I said, well, Ken, why would you care? He says, Don, if a burglar comes over the fence, the sprinkler's my first line of defense. So, we've got pervasive mobility. We're now connected at all times, and this is an extraordinary thing. And what it's doing, next slide, please. It's taking us into the second half of the chessboard. Do any of you know this analogy? Couple, yeah. The inventor of chess was called into the Chinese emperor's palace, and the emperor said, and I paraphrase, "I love this game, you can have anything you want." And the inventor said, and I paraphrase, "Cool. I would like a single grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, and I'd like 2 grains of rice on the second square, and 4 grains of rice on the third square, and just continue that." And the emperor, figuring this is a few bags of rice, said, "Are you sure?" And the inventor said yes, and he granted the wish. 2 days later, the emperor had done the math and figured out that every square inch of planet Earth would need to be covered by rice fields to deliver on this wish. And that's what's happening with the digital revolution. The last 20 years was the first half of the chessboard, and we're now moving into a period where technology is accelerating at a rate that's so fast that I think it's beginning to move beyond our ability as individuals, as institutions, and as societies to even comprehend it, let alone to manage it and exploit it effectively. And this is taking us into a new period in human history. I think that the Industrial Revolution is finally coming to a logical end, and we are moving into a new digital age, or an age of networked intelligence. If you look around today, you'll see a whole set of institutions that are in various stages of being stalled or frozen or in atrophy or even failing, contrasted with a set of sparkling new initiatives that show potential, that show how this could be done very differently. So on the upper left, the Industrial Age Corporation. Well, it was typified by General Motors, America's greatest company. It went bankrupt. The financial system. The core modus operandi of Wall Street almost brought down global capitalism. Has it changed? Newspapers. I guarantee your newspaper will not be delivered to your doorstep made of atoms 20 years from now, probably 10 years from now. The problem that newspapers solved is no longer really a problem. So one youngster said to us, if the news is important, it will find me. Our models of solving global problems, our universities and schools, all of these are based on an industrial model, where something at the top pushed out standard units to passive recipients. The industrial age was an age of scale and of standardization. We pushed out newspapers, products, radio shows, government services, lectures, one to many, one size fits all, you're inert. Well, now we're moving into a new period where we have a new age, an age of networked intelligence. Now, just before I get into the 5 themes, let me flash back in a typical Trent way and look at the really big picture here. We'll go back a few centuries. All around the world, we had an industrial age, and the means of production and political system was called feudalism, and knowledge was tightly concentrated in tiny oligopolies of the church and of the state. And people didn't have knowledge, really. They didn't know about things. There was no concept of progress. You were just sort of born, and you lived your life, and you died. And then along came Johannes Gutenberg with his great invention. And over time, people, different parts of the society began to acquire knowledge. And when they did, the institutions of feudal society appeared to be stalled or frozen or in atrophy or even failing. It didn't make sense for the church to be responsible for medicine when people had knowledge. Martin Luther called the printing press God's highest act of grace. So we saw the rise of science, the corporation, the modern university, all these new institutions, and it was good. But it did come with a cost. And now once again, the technology genie is out of the bottle, only this time it's very different. The printing press gave us access to the written word. The internet enables each of us to be a publisher. The printing press gave us access to recorded knowledge. The internet gives us access to knowledge, yeah, but also to the intelligence contained in the crania of other people on a global basis. To me, this is not fundamentally an information age. Just go back if you could, please. It's an age of networked intelligence. It's an age of vast new opportunity and promise. But when you look around today, many of the promises are not being fulfilled. Why don't we have growing prosperity? How can we be in a period of history where growth in the economy does not create growth in jobs? How can social inequality be growing? So we need some ideas to change the world. So let me go through 5. First is on education. Now, to start on this, we no longer have an economy where we create wealth by brain. Increasingly, we create wealth by brain. Knowledge work is becoming central to the entire economy in many, many ways. And we're going to talk about this afternoon in the education panel. This is one of the arguments on why we need a liberal arts education. Because when I graduated from Trent in 1970, you sort of chose a field and you kind of kept up, and you were pretty much set for life. Today, graduates know that they're not set for life. They're set for 15 minutes. And if you took a technical course, half of what you learn in the first year is obsolete by the time you get to the 4th year. So graduates today from Trent know that they're going to have to learn lifelong. They're going to have to reinvent their knowledge base. And the purpose of education, to me, is not to equip or train young people for their next job. The purpose of education is to enable them to think critically, to not just be good employees to meet labor market demands, but to be good citizens for a world that's in transformation. We need young people who can collaborate, put things into context, understand the interrelationship between things, and reinvent themselves. You know, your career is like a milk carton. It's got a time stamp on it, and it's going to go sour really fast unless you're constantly changing it. So if that's the purpose of education, how can we have a model of pedagogy that enables that purpose to be achieved? Well, today the model of education is the industrial age model. It's based on the lecture. One way, one size fits all, everyone's passive in the learning experience. It's like, I'm a teacher, I have knowledge, you're a student, you don't, get ready, here it comes. And let me caricaturize the lecture. The lecture is the process whereby the notes of a lecturer go to the notes of a student without going through the brains of either. Now, I appreciate the irony that I'm standing up here giving you a lecture. But this is actually not a good way of learning. I'm trying to convince you of a couple of ideas. I don't know if you'd even remember all 5. That's going to be really tough. Lectures are good for motivating people, but there are better models of pedagogy that are possible today. See, the old way is focused on the teacher. It's one way, it's one size fits all, and the student's isolated. There's a new model that's emerging that's centered on the student, that's multi-way, that's customized, and that's collaborative. So, to me, there are 3 things. When it comes to mastery of content, where there's a right or wrong answer, and even in university, there's a lot of content where there's a right or wrong answer. You know, what's the result of this analysis of variance? You know, what's the R squared on a regression analysis? Where there's a right or wrong answer, all the research shows that the best way to learn that is interactively through software on a computer. You know, when I did my master's degree in education at the University of Alberta, in 1975, I took a statistics course in a computer lab. 1975. And I went through this stuff at my own pace, and it said, do you want to test yourself? And I test myself, and I get a couple of things wrong. Do you want to test yourself again? Yeah, I'd go over it. I remember thinking, wow, someone saw me going over this again and again. They'd think I was really dumb. But nobody saw me doing it, and I went over it until I got it right. There were no lectures, but let's face it, the statistics lecture by definition is a bust, right? There's no one in the audience. I mean, everyone is either bored or they don't get it. Now, I got an A, but most kids in the class got an A up from a B- from 2 years ago when the standard approach was used. And I ended up being really good at statistics. I ended up with a graduate degree in research methodology, and I won the big scholarship for the university. And I thought, wow, 5 years from now, lectures will be gone. That was 1975. So where there's mastery, you do that in a flipped classroom from your dorm, your parents' bedroom, or if you're a high school student or a student at home. And then you come to class and you do the really important stuff. Where teachers, their role doesn't become less important, it becomes more important because it frees up teachers from being transmitters of data to doing what only teachers and only humans can do, which is to work with people in a custom way. So you have small group discussion along Trent, the model of Trent, and you have projects where you learn. Now, the little example that I have here is a company called Nixware. My daughter did her graduate degree, an MBA at INSEAD outside of Paris, and she and her best friend, Joanna Griffiths, they all had to do a project to create a business plan. And they created a business that would reinvent women's underwear. Your underwear should do more. High-tech, multitasking underwear. Underwear for the good. The next generation. Underwear hasn't changed in centuries. This is the next don't ask. Anyway. They created this project, and there was a big competition, 45 teams. They ended up winning. Now they've created the business. This is a growing business. It's doing fabulously. They're hiring people. And they learn more in that project than they could have in a lifetime of sitting passively in a lecture theater. So now this is simplification hugely. when it comes to mastery, it's not just about interacting with some software. There are all kinds of great, rich, interactive, collaborative learning environments on computers that help you master a topic where there's a right or wrong answer. And that frees you up to do the really important stuff. So we have collaborative learning environments, smart classrooms, all kinds of things. I'm going to have to move along here. Now, there's a tidal wave that's causing the university to change, and that's MOOCs, massively open online courseware. Now, these are very primitive at this point. A lot of them are just lectures online that are structured into courses. But MOOCs are evolving, and they're changing, and they're going to become this interactive learning environment, as I described. And all of the projections say there'll be more university courses delivered through MOOCs within the estimates are 5 to 10 years than all of the university courses combined, delivered in the old way. So this is a huge challenge to the traditional model of the university, but to me it's an opportunity. If universities reinvent themselves and start to embrace these new tools, then they can change the whole model of pedagogy. Now, people say, well, you're all enamored by technology. It's actually not about technology at all. It's a change in the relationship between the student and the teacher in the learning process. And it's about sharing in the creation of content. Now, if we had schools like Amherst College, my son went there undergraduate, then you don't need any technology, really. I mean, class size of 8 to 1, 1,600 students, an endowment of $1.6 billion, which I think is bigger than the University of Toronto. And he was sitting there in a class with 8 students, and his prof is won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on Russia, and they're interacting with the students. And it was like Trent, when I went to Trent. You know, my biology seminar was me and the prof. Who's done their homework? Who'd like to answer this question? But through the effective use of technology, we can reinvent that. You see, Trent was always about, as its mantra says today, about learning that's purposeful, that's personalized, that's collaborative, and that's transformational. And that's why I went to Trent many, many years ago. And Trent attempts to achieve that today. I would argue to you that you can't achieve that unless you move the mastery part into the 21st century. Now, what about the campus? Is this what we want with education, for young people to be sitting in their parents' basements interacting with computers? Is that the new model of learning? I think that's a big mistake. I mean, I was on a panel once with the former dean of sociology from Princeton. He'd been the dean for 20 years. And we were talking about this, and he says, you know, Don, there's a great role for the campus. Among other things, it's a place where young people can go for 4 years and get older. And they're bound to learn something while they're there, he says. We need campuses. And it would be a terrible thing if learning moved to be an isolated, interactive environment that simply was based on technology. But if we don't reinvent the university, then someone else is going to deliver post-secondary education. Now, I'd like to end this part, and I'm going to have to speed this up, with a story to make the point. Oh, good. The story is, all things come to those who wait. In 2008, I was invited to Florida State University, and I was asked to spend a very long lunch with the deans and the management of the university. It's about 25 people. We were sitting there around a table. They were doing $1 billion fundraise, and they wanted to create the first 21st century university, and they were asking my view on what that was. So I gave a little talk where I said, you got a technology push for change. You got a demand pull from a new generation of learners. My generation grew up being the passive recipients of TV, so sitting in a lecture hall was kind of the right model for learning for me. These kids have grown up interacting. And we have an opportunity to reinvent the university, pedagogy, the relationship between the university and other institutions in society. At the end of my little talk, I got a little applause, very tepid. And one of the deans said to the one young person in the room, 22 years old, his name was Joe. Joe, you're the one student here. Why don't you start off the discussion? And Joe says, well, I've been sitting here reflecting on this, and it's relating to me. I think, actually, as a generation, we probably do learn differently. Let me give you an example. I don't read books. And the look in the room was kind of like the look in this room right now. He says, I think I'm knowledgeable. And again, I'm paraphrasing what he said. So he sort of said, I know what's in books, but I don't actually read books. He says, I go out onto the internet to find information and knowledge, and I've got pretty good BS detectors to know what's good and what's not good. He says, if I need to read a book, I go onto Google Books and I can get a chapter of a book, and I'm pretty good at figuring out what's the right chapter to figure out somebody's thesis. And if I have to read a whole book, I don't follow someone's narrative. I don't go from the beginning to the end. I'm bouncing around, I'm out on the net, I'm into the index and the table of contents, and I'm coming back and checking on stuff. I don't read books. So the dean of the film school was sitting beside me, and he said, well, thank you, Joe. I don't know if that's very interesting and exciting for us, or if it means the end of civilization. So they get into this amazing discussion. I'm thrilled with the way it goes. And at the end, I said to him, Joe, I'd like to get to know you. And he said, I have to leave right now. I'm flying to Fort Lauderdale. So they'd given me a plane for the day, so I said, great, I'll give you a lift. Hop in the plane with me, and off we go. So I interviewed him. And I said to him, tell me about yourself. He says, what do you want to know? I said, what kind of student are you? He says, I'm a good student. I said, how good? He said, I've always had A's, 4.0 grade average. So he's actually perfect. I said, did you do anything else here? He says, well, I'm the president of the Students' Council, have been for 2 years, so I've got a budget of $12 million. I'm on 18 committees, and I chair 11 of them, and that takes some time. And I said, I'm sure it does. Do you do anything else? He said, well, usual sports stuff. He said the really big thing was my first year, Katrina hit in New Orleans, and my girlfriend is from New Orleans, so we went down there to see if we could help, and there was no healthcare clinic in the devastated 9th Ward, so I set one up. I said, you set up a healthcare clinic? He says, yeah, if you have the internet, you can do anything you want to do. You need an air conditioner, you can find an air conditioner. I said, what happened? Did it work out? He says, yeah, it's still functioning. It's called the 9th Ward Healthcare Clinic. It sees 9,000 patients a year. And I said, well, that's good. I said, tell me about your family. He sighed. And I touched something sensitive. He says, it's been a bad year. Both of my parents passed away in the last year. One in an accident and the other got sick. I said, oh, geez, I'm so sorry. Do you have siblings? And he says, yeah, a bunch of them, and I'm the eldest, so it's my job to keep the family together. I said, how do you do that? He says, well, they don't live here, so we're on the internet all day long. We're texting, we're in social media. He says, you know, the best thing I found out is we created a guild on World of Warcraft, and we slayed dragons together as a family. It's like, just great. That's cool. I said, what are you doing next year? He says, well, I'm going to London. I'm going to study, and I'm very excited because I'll have the British healthcare system. We just never went to the doctor as kids, you know, because we were from a poor family. And so he knows all about the British healthcare system. He knows about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He knows about Ronald Coase's theory of transaction costs and the firm. He's as knowledgeable as anybody I've met. He doesn't read books. So I said, where are you going? He says, I'm going to Oxford. I'm doing a master's in philosophy. And I said, that's great, Joe. I mean, did you get some financial aid? He says, oh, yeah, I got the scholarship. It's great. It's going to cover everything. I said, where did that come from? He says, oh, it's called a Rhodes Scholarship. Bob Dylan, there's something going on here, and you don't know what it is. The Rhodes Scholar from Florida in 2008 doesn't read books. So This is a time of profound change, and if we will listen to the students, the most powerful force to change the schools and the universities is the students. This is the first time in history when the young people are an authority on something really important, and they can teach us so much. I'm going to have to pick up the pace on the next 4, so let's do that. Life and health. Well, we have an industrial age model of healthcare. I'm a clinician, I have knowledge, you're a patient, you don't. I deliver healthcare to you. You're inert and passive in this process. Please don't go on the internet because you'll get a lot of garbage, and don't collaborate with anyone else because you're going to get all confused. One way, one size fits all. I got control, I got the knowledge, I deliver it to you. You're inert in the experience. And these have got to be actors. I mean, that's... Well, what's the new model? Well, there's an environment called Patients Like Me, created by a guy whose brother had ALS. And today, 20% of all people with ALS in North America collaborate on this environment. They learn from each other. They understand the impact of drug interactions. Someone discovers this or that, or a diet thing. Clinicians love this because it's generating all this knowledge about the disease, and Patients Like Me is now getting into all kinds of different diseases and disorders, including psychiatric disorders like depression. So could we move towards, is that a little tip of the iceberg of a whole new paradigm? Well, here it is. That you participate in health communities, and every baby in Canada gets a website when they're born, their personal web page, and we all get one too. And it's half your electronic healthcare record. It's private, secure. The clinicians provide the data, but you have transparency into your own record. And it's also a social network for health. So if you have diabetes, you go into a diabetes community, or you create one. It's just like Facebook, basically. You come in the morning, and there's a news feed, and you get to input information, and so on. This would generate massive data that could be transformative for medical research. And healthcare professionals could change from being the deliverers of healthcare to people who curate healthy citizens rather than just patients. You know, look at something like obesity, huge problem. How are we going to fix this? By telling people they shouldn't eat so much? Isolation is the #1 risk factor in health. Imagine if people who had a weight problem could participate in communities. We know this works. Weight Watchers works. You build communities as opposed to the old industrial model of delivering healthcare to passive recipients. This is a new model that embraces my 5 principles for transformation. It's about collaboration, it's about openness, it's about sharing data and information, it's about interdependence, understanding that just like business can't succeed in a world that's failing, clinicians can't succeed in a world where we have all these massive social problems that are causing terrible healthcare outcomes. And integrity. Integrity is about doing the right thing. Now let's apply this to research in healthcare. The model of healthcare research that we have today, and again, I'm trying to be provocative here, is the antithesis of those 5 principles. You have researchers that compete for grants, and then they get the money, and then they work together without collaborating. They do this in secrecy. They don't share their data. They work in these little silos within universities and hospitals and so on. And sure, they're good people. They try and act with integrity, but it's doing the right thing for that institution, that hospital, that university. It's not about, and building it up and building its reputation, it's not about actually trying to solve healthcare problems in the most effective way. So this is changing in many ways. The pharmaceutical companies are falling over something called the patent cliff. They're losing this year 25% of their revenue. What do? Cut back on office supplies? No. We need to change the model of pharmaceutical research. And in fact, there are very few breakthroughs that are happening now. Very few big blockbuster drugs in the pipeline, if any. Pharmaceutical companies need to start sharing clinical trial data, and this is going to happen. We'll create a commons, a human genome of clinical trial data, a Linux of clinical trial data. Imagine how that's going to leapfrog healthcare research. And breakthroughs in medicine could be possible if we achieve this. Will there be lots of problems to achieve this in research in general? Well, of course. But more and more, there are smart people who are saying this needs to be done. I'm actually on the research committee at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And Bruce Pollack, who's the VP of Research, says real breakthroughs in the discovering causes of effective treatments of mental illness will occur when the silos within and between institutions doing research fall. We need to move to a new era of collaboration and the sharing of data and knowledge. You know, mental health research, Bruce says there hasn't really been a breakthrough in 60 years. If you have schizophrenia today, you're getting the derivatives of the same medications that someone got 60 years ago. Why is this? Is the brain too hard to understand, or is our model wrong? Well, more and more people are saying our model's wrong. This is Trevor Young, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. He says there's a long tradition of sharing data and international collaboration on patient care. It works well. We need to apply that to discovery, to research as well. So that's a big idea about transforming research. And when it comes to mental health research, this is actually beginning to happen. You have the Structural Genomics Consortium of people working together now. The Psychiatric Genomics Consortium that are sharing all kinds of data. Look at this. Data sharing, data visualization, and open source philosophy, and so on. Wow, if this can happen, it'll be a breakthrough. Welcome to the world of collaboration. The Ontario Brain Institute is trying to get these institutions to work together. The Toronto Dementia Research Alliance. This is unthinkable that these kinds of things would have happened 10 years ago, and now they're just beginning to happen. We need to understand them and embrace them. The Organization for Human Brain Mapping. Neuroscientists now across the United States, involve people in Canada, and soon internationally, working to map out the brain. Oh, okay. So, I'm going to spend 3 minutes each on the remaining ones. Critical cultural inquiry. So, people like me have been saying for some time that the internet should advance public discourse. Imagine everyone now, rather than passively receiving the information that was controlled by broadcasters or their advertisers, now having access to a world of information, all this rich data. Surely the truth will set us free, and that we'll move into a new period of better understanding, of deep discussion, of great discourse, and where we can start to align together on all kinds of important initiatives that are required for society. The old media were one way, they were centralized, they were controlled by their powerful owners. You know the old expression, the printing press was really a great idea, especially if you own a printing press. Well, the new media is the antithesis of all of that. It's not one to many, it's one to one. It's many to many. It has this awesome neutrality. It will be what we want it to be. Surely, as a civilization, we will make it a platform for enriching ourselves and the way that we think. Billions of people, soon 6 billion people, now collaborating on this platform. The trouble is, the evidence that this thing that I hoped for in the digital economy 20 years ago is happening in a very uneven way at best. And there are all kinds of problems that are emerging. So one of them is the so-called drowning in information. You know, Eric Schmidt says that between the beginning of time and 2003, humanity recorded 5 exabytes of information. That's a lot. An exabyte is a quintillion bytes. He says, and I heard him say this 2 years ago, in the last 48 hours, we recorded 5 exabytes of information. According to my math, in the last 8 hours today, we recorded 5 exabytes of information. Now, a lot of that is cat videos. But a lot of that is other stuff too. And so, do we have an information overload? Maybe we have a filter under capacity. Public discourse. There's a real problem that's emerging, whereby we're starting to see a fragmented conversation in the public world where you end up reinforcing our own points of view. New information has come to light that, rather than may compromise our position, now confirms my point of view. So you look at the United States today, there's a rise of all this anti-scientific thinking, where all kinds of people are not vaccinating their children, for example. We've got, around climate change, 99.9% of the scientists in the world think that this is a really big problem, but there's a whole climate change denier industry. And it doesn't just come from vested interests. According to Paul Krugman, it comes from the rise of a new anti-intellectualism that exists in the United States. If knowledgeable and accredited and authoritative people say it, it must be wrong. We've got the rise of all these conspiracy theories, you know, around the whole discussion about flight, whatever that was, what was that? MH17? Yeah, all the different crazy theories about that. And if you Google conspiracy theories about Malaysian Airlines, there are like thousands and thousands of these wacko kind of concepts that have come up. Then we have the rise of new ideologies. Everything from the Tea Party on the extreme right in the United States, that many of them favor things like the elimination of public education, that women should be back in the home and barefoot and not in the workforce and pregnant and so on, right to very strong religious ideologies that exist all around the world. So is there a danger that we'll all end up in these self-reinforcing echo chambers, where the purpose of information is not to inform us, but it's to give us comfort? How do we overcome this problem? Well, it's a good conversation to have. I have some views. I think that we need to design, each of us, our media diet. I force myself to read a couple of articles from beginning to end every day, even though I don't like doing it. I know I got the idea here, but I force myself to read the entire article. Developing your personal BS detectors, like Joe, understanding what's good information and what's not a good information. Each of us needs to inform ourselves about points of view that we don't necessarily agree with. I interviewed a young woman on a panel once, and she said, I have news feeds that come to me from sources that I know I'm going to disagree with, but I want to hear them because I want to make sure I'm not wrong, and if I am right, I want to understand what the other point of view is saying to deepen my own thinking. Number 4, Indigenous peoples in Canada. Well, for this audience, I don't think that I need to spend a lot of time talking about the problem. Now, these are some photos that mainly come from reserves, because that's what I want to talk about. But if you look at data overall, you know, employment among Aboriginal peoples is 15%. Youth unemployment is easily double that, whereas non-Aboriginal, it's 6.3. This is youth employment rates. It looks at all youth, 10% higher. Medium income, you know the data, $10,000 more. Social assistance, 5% in all of Canada, 33 for Aboriginal communities. Some communities and on the Indian reserves, they're higher than 80%. Percent of the population without a high school diploma, 12 versus almost 30%. Life expectancy, I mean, on and on it goes. How do we solve this problem? Well, here's an idea. You know where jobs come from? Jobs are the key to everything, to me. 80% of new jobs come from companies that are 5 years old or less. There are already 26,000, according to David Newhouse, Aboriginal entrepreneurs, companies in Canada. could we move to a new halcyon day of Aboriginal entrepreneurship? Because the internet enables little companies to have all the capabilities of big companies without the main bureaucracy, or without the main liabilities. How do we do that? Well, it turns out that a key to building these entrepreneurs, and I'm talking mainly about on the reserves, 60% of Aboriginals now live in cities, not on reserves. But on the reserves, there's a lot of stuff that we could do, and a lot's going on. I'll just tell you about one. It's called Mentor Nation. Actually, that turns out to be a video, but we're not going to watch it. But this is a community of mentors providing guidance and support and assistance to entrepreneurs in Aboriginal communities. And it went onto the internet to raise some funds to do this. And it was a very cool thing. So lots of people took on a target. So I took on a target here of that I said I would raise $4,000. Then I sent out emails to everybody I know saying, contribute along with me to this. And they've raised, I think it's close to $100,000 crowdfunding to provide these a mentorship for entrepreneurs in Aboriginal communities. Go to Mentor Nation and have a look and see what you think, and maybe you could personally contribute. This is for every one of these people who volunteered to raise some money, as I did. We have our own little video, and then all of my friends go there, and when they make a donation, it says how much they donated if they want to, with a little picture of them, or they can even have their own little video on why they made this donation as well. This is the internet for good. The final one is around sustainability and environment. Do I have to convince anyone here that climate change is a big problem? Bill Clinton at Davos a couple of years ago was saying if we reduce carbon emissions by 80% in the year 2050, and we need to do that, if we do it by 80%, not by 6%, by 80%, it'll still take 1,000 years for the planet to cool down. In the meantime, some bad things are going to happen. You can expect, he says, 1.5 billion people to lose at least half of their water supply in the next decade. There's a new book called The Sixth Extinction that says we're going through one of these extinctions right now, like the dinosaur extinction. And the scientists differ on how many species will be wiped out in the next 100 years. And the estimates range from 15% to some saying 60%. Interesting questions. Will bees be one of those? And of course, well, may humans be one of those as well? So, how are we going to fix this problem? Well, the old approach is that nation states get together in global institutions. And that approach is 70 years and 1 week old. 70 years ago, 44 countries met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and they created the World Bank and the IMF. And a year later, they created the UN, and a year later, UNESCO and the ISO, and then the GATT and the WTO and the G8 and the G20, global institutions based on nation states. Trouble is, the nation state is kind of like the wrong size for a lot of these problems. And if you're a problem like climate change, you don't really know about nation states. You're just a problem. So, is there a possibility of a new model emerging? Well, this is half of my time right now is exploring that new model. I call them global solution networks. Global networks that are, first of all, multi-stakeholder. They involve companies, civil society organizations, NGOs, academics, foundations, governments, and individuals working together. They are addressing a global problem. They use the digital revolution to help them, and they're not controlled by a state or a state-based institution. These networks today, right now, are engaging tens of thousands of organizations and tens of millions of people on a daily basis, and nobody really knows about them. So how could we apply these to solving the problem of climate change? Well, it turns out there are 10 types of these networks, and I can't really go through them, but we have knowledge networks that just create knowledge, advocacy networks, Any of you seen the video, Kony 2012, about the Ugandan warlord, Joseph Kony? K-O-N-Y, ask your kids. 90 million people watch this video, half-an-hour video in 1 week. We've got operational and delivery networks. My daughter lives in the East Village in New York, and when Hurricane Sandy hit, you couldn't find the traditional institutions, but you put out some tweets to Crisis Commons, a network, and people just showed up with sandbags. There are watchdog networks that scrutinize. There are standards networks that create standards, and so on. Every one of these is different. For every one of these circles, climate change, people care about climate change, are kicking into action. And if you aggregate them all together, you're starting to see a network that could actually govern the climate. We've got knowledge networks like the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. They're just trying to better understand carbon, what's going on, what's happening to our biosphere. You've got operational and delivery networks that just kick in. They're not talking about it, they're not advocating, they're not creating knowledge, they just go into Honduras and clean up oil spills. You've got policy networks that are working on creating new policies. They're not controlled by states, though. You've got advocacy networks that are now building a movement. Avaz is one, 35 million people on a network that are collaborating and advocating that governments need to change. We've got watchdog networks that are in the transparency business, just scrutinizing what's happening today to the climate and its impacts. You've got platforms, well, Avaz is an example too. They're enabling others to self-organize on this platform. Now, people use Avaz to self-organize around other issues as well. There are global standards network creating all kinds of standards around carbon. There are network institutions like the World Economic Forum, the Clinton Global Initiative, and so on, that are doing all kinds of things in tackling this issue. What if we put them all together? Could we create a governance network? Well, you can start to see this happen. In September in New York is the first truly multi-stakeholder conference on climate change, because that's what we need to do. We need a governance network that involves all these different stakeholders and that can mobilize the world. We've been mobilized before as a civilization in the First and Second World Wars, but we were on different sides. Now we need to mobilize the world so that we're on the same side. Every company and every government at every level, every NGO, kids in their schoolyards, families taking on quotas. It turns out the killer app for the internet may be saving the planet, literally. To close, this is a time of great change. And I'm hoping that the discussion today will be a rich one, and that we won't just be tinkering about how could we fix this or tweak that or so on, but that we'll be exploring very fundamental change in each of these 5 areas. And I've attempted to describe 5 big ideas on these 5 topics. I started out on sort of a depressing note, and will the future be a bleak one? Well, to me, the future is not something to be predicted. It's something to be achieved. And we can achieve a very different future than the future that appears to be emerging for us. But if we're going to do that, we need some big ideas, and we need to all get involved. And if we do that by the tens and hundreds of millions, then maybe this smaller network world that our children inherit may be a better one. I'm going to end with a sort of chancellor thought, if I might, as well. And it's sort of a personal confession that when I left Trent, I lost contact with the university for a long period. And people like Tony Story, sitting in the audience, kept sending me emails, and I kept saying, why is this guy sending me emails? And it was a couple of decades later, I decided to get involved again. I ended up chairing the capital campaign for Trent, and I became an active alumnus. And I did that not out of a sense of obligation or not out of a sense that there might be some personal benefits for me in being part of this community, which of course there are, but out of a sense that this institution is worth defending, and it's worth preserving and advancing, and that the DNA of Trent is the DNA of the 21st century educational institution, and that I have an opportunity as an alum to participate in ensuring that this institution thrives for the next period. So I hope that all of you who are alumni will come to the same conclusion. If this is the first time you've had contact with the university, there are a lot of people out there in cyberspace watching this, that you might think, yeah, maybe there's a role for me in participating in this community to help change a world that does need changing. Thank you very much.